She was banished while pregnant. Her twins returned as the strongest Alphas. The harvest invocation was supposed to be the most sacred day of her reign. It was meant to be a day of feasting, of golden fires, and spoken vows of prosperity for the coming harsh winter. Instead, it became the moment Aveline Thorn's entire world shattered. Everything turned to ash. The sprawling, cavernous main hall of the Northern Keep was built specifically to humble the weak. A brutal, unforgiving expanse of black iron and jagged, unpolished stone. Its vaulted ceilings were lost in perpetual shadows, supported by massive pillars carved to resemble the great, ancestral wolves of the founding era. Their stone eyes seemed to glare down in silent judgment, their fangs bared in a permanent, silent snarl that warned against any act of treason. The heavy, stained glass windows, usually glowing with the warm, amber light of the setting sun, were currently choked by a ferocious, unnatural blizzard. Frost crawled across the intricate glass panes, obscuring the colourful depictions of old victories and leaving only a stark grey twilight to illuminate the trial. The air inside the vast chamber tasted of crushed pine, cold iron, and the sharp bite of freezing rain. It was the bitter, relentless chill that seeped mercilessly through the thin soles of Aveline's embroidered silk slippers, creeping up her ankles and settling deep into the marrow of her bones. She had been dragged from her chambers before dawn, allowed no time to don a heavier cloak. The thin silk offered zero barrier against the biting draught that swept across the elevated stone dais. The heavy iron chains draped across the executioner's dais clinked softly in the draught, a steady, metallic rhythm that underscored the severe gravity of the trial. Every scrape of link against stone sounded like a ticking clock, counting down the final seconds of her life as Luna. She stood perfectly still in the center of the raised platform. Her spine was a rod of forged steel. Her breathing was meticulously controlled, shallow and silent, betraying absolutely zero panic to the predators circling her. The assembled nobles whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes wide with a sick, hungry fascination. They wanted a show, they wanted tears, but Aveline would give them nothing. Her silver eyes, the rare genetic marker of a bloodline long thought extinct, were beautiful the way a blade was beautiful, unwavering. They were lethal in their absolute calm. They remained locked entirely on the sovereign seated above her, Gideon Vance, the Alpha King of the North, her husband, her fated mate. He did not look like the man who had whispered desperate prayers against her skin the night before. The man who had buried his face in her neck and sworn that she was his only salvation. He sat rigid upon the massive iron throne, his broad, terrifyingly powerful shoulders tense under the immense weight of his dark fur mantle. His storm-grey eyes, which usually softened only for her, were completely dilated. They were clouded with an unnatural, sickly film that turned his irises into opaque, dead glass. The audience of assembled nobles, clustered in the shadows like waiting vultures in their silks and velvets, could not see the micro-tremors vibrating through his massive hands. They did not notice the way his knuckles had gone completely white as he gripped the armrests, the ancient stone cracking slightly under his sheer force. His own flesh was fighting a silent, agonizing war against a chemical invasion. Aveline saw it. She felt it. The sacred thread woven between their souls, stretching, tearing, bleeding in real time. It was not a metaphorical pain. It was a sudden, violent physical agony that punched all the oxygen from her lungs, causing the blood in her veins to turn to sludge. A cold, freezing ache aggressively replaced the burning gold of their fated connection, spreading a phantom frost through her chest where his warmth used to reside. The sensation was biological, an absolute severing of cellular recognition that made her vision swim with dark, suffocating spots. To the left of the Iron Throne stood Sibylla Frost. The usurper Duchess wore an immaculate gown of midnight velvet, her sharp, aristocratic face beautiful in the way a winter frost was beautiful. She was lethal, quiet, and completely devoid of mercy. Her pale blue eyes tracked every micro-expression on the king's face, cold and calculating, measuring the exact dosage of her treachery. A faint, sweet, cloying scent radiated from the older woman, cutting sharply through the ambient chill of the grand hall. Poisoned honey and decaying lavender. It was the distinct olfactory signature of the soul fracture potion. The dark, viscous liquid had been slipped into the king's morning tea under the guise of a restorative tonic. Was specifically designed to mimic the biological sensation of a dying mate bond, violently forcing his inner beast to perceive his true mate as a deadly, encroaching threat. Gideon's human mind was suffocating beneath the oppressive weight of the usurper's venom, drowning in an orchestrated paranoia he could neither articulate nor fight. He would not know it now, but years later, that specific, sickeningly sweet scent of poisoned honey and decaying lavender would become the very trigger that shattered his delusions, turning his stomach and driving him mad with absolute regret. The silence in the vast chamber stretched, brittle and freezing, pulling taut like a bowstring meant to execute a queen. Sibylla stepped forward, her heels clicking against the stone in a sharp, predatory cadence. In her pale, ringed hands, she held a thick parchment bound in crimson leather, the forged ledger, the physical manifestation of a carefully orchestrated lie. It detailed false treason, non-existent poisonings, and a fabricated conspiracy to open the northern borders to the rogue armies, all bearing Aveline's flawlessly forged seal. Aveline did not even glance at the book. She knew exactly what it was. She knew that arguing against it was entirely useless. The trap had been set weeks ago, slowly tightening, while she had been distracted by the sudden, overwhelming physiological changes in her own body. Her body. Beneath the thin, freezing silk of her gown, Aveline's hand twitched, driven by a primal, desperate instinct to press flat against her lower abdomen. She forced her fingers to remain curled rigidly at her sides. Her nails bit so deeply into her palms that she felt the warm, wet slide of her own blood. It was the only thing keeping her grounded. The physical sting kept her breathing. She was exactly 1 month pregnant. She had only discovered the truth 3 days ago. A subtle shift in her scent, masked heavily by the natural pine and ozone of the northern altitudes. The faint, rapid flutter of not one, but 2 secondary heartbeats echoing against the protective walls of her ribs. Twins. She carried the next generation of the Valdron monarchy in the absolute dark, waiting for this very harvest invocation to share the joyous news with her fated mate. Instead, her fated mate was currently drowning in a sea of chemically induced paranoia, his dilated eyes staring at her as if she were a rabid beast meant for the slaughter. A heavy silver pendant rested against Aveline's collarbone, the Winterbane crest. It had been Gideon's first gift to her, a sacred marker of his protection and his absolute devotion. No cold shall touch you while my heart beats, he had sworn in the dark of their nesting room, pressing his lips to the heavy silver wolf etched into the metal. Now, the metal felt like a brand of dry ice against her skin. It was leaching the warmth directly from her veins, a physical reminder of the void where his soul used to touch hers. The evidence is irrefutable, my king. Sibylla's voice rang out, melodic and completely devoid of soul. It was a voice designed to slice through the ambient draft, echoing off the high vaulted ceilings so that every noble in the assembly could hear. The Luna has conspired against the crown. She has traded Valdron secrets to the southern rogues. Her treason has endangered the very foundation of your reign. Whispers erupted from the shadows. The nobles of the court, dressed in their opulent furs and thick velvets, leaned forward like starving hounds scenting blood. They had never liked her. Aveline Thorn came from a lineage deemed extinct, a bloodline of quiet survival and ancient unspoken magic that made the modern, politically ambitious Pax deeply uncomfortable. She was too quiet, too observant. She did not play their games of flattery and poisoned wine, and they hated her for it. Treason, a lord muttered in the front row. Execution, hissed a lady draped in white mink. Aveline ignored them all. She kept her chin parallel to the stone floor, her silver eyes remaining locked entirely on the king. Look at me. She screamed the words in the silent, hollowed-out cavern of her mind. Look at me and see through the rot. His beast was heavily sedated, buried alive beneath the oppressive weight of the treacherous elixir. Gideon shifted on the iron throne, the massive chains of his own regalia clinking harshly. When he finally spoke, the sound did not belong to the man who loved her. It was a brutal, grating sound, like two heavy stones grinding against each other in the dark. Aveline Thorn. Her name from his lips felt like a physical blow. The absolute lack of the mate bond resonance in his tone was staggering. Usually, when he spoke her name, a golden hum would vibrate through her marrow, a biological reassurance of absolute safety. Now there was only the metallic, dead echo of a stranger. "You stand accused of high treason," Gideon continued, his jaw locking so tightly that the muscles in his neck strained against his collar. The micro-tremors in his hands were worsening. The stone armrests of his throne began to crumble into grey dust under his grip, the deep, instinctual part of his brain. The ancient wolf that recognized its true mate was violently clawing at the chemical cage Sibylla had built, but it was losing the battle. The poisoned honey scent in the air grew thicker, cloying and suffocating. The punishment for treason against the sovereign fortress is death. The hall fell into a terrifying, breathless silence. The blizzard outside howled, throwing handfuls of ice against the stained glass, threatening to shatter the windows entirely. Aveline did not flinch. She did not weep. She stood like a statue carved from winter itself. "He is going to kill me," she thought. The realization was completely detached from panic. It was a cold, absolute fact. Her hand twitched again, the maternal instinct roaring to life, demanding she shift, demanding she tear through the guards to protect the unformed lives inside her. Gideon squeezed his eyes shut for a fraction of a second. A bead of cold sweat tracked down his temple. The chemical war in his blood was reaching a critical threshold. However, the Alpha King gritted out, every syllable sounding as if it were being violently extracted from his throat. "I will not spill the blood of the woman who once warmed my bed. You are stripped of your title. You are stripped of your pack. I reject this bond. I banish you from this royal citadel to the freezing wastes of the Whispering Woods. You will leave immediately. If you are seen within Valdron borders by dawn, you will be executed without trial." The words dropped like heavy lead anvils into the icy air. "I reject this bond." The finality of the statement was a biological catastrophe. The sacred thread connecting their souls did not just stretch or bleed this time. It violently snapped. Aveline gasped, a short, sharp inhalation of pure, unfiltered agony as the metaphysical tether ripped away from her heart. It felt as though a jagged, rusted hook had been buried in her chest and violently yanked out, taking half her soul with it. She swayed on her feet, the world tilting precariously as black spots danced across her vision. Her wolf whimpered, a pathetic dying sound in the dark recesses of her consciousness, before curling into a tight, silent ball of grief. "It is done," Sibylla whispered softly, a triumphant smirk curving her blood-red lips. The assembled court waited. They waited for the breakdown. They expected the former Luna of Valdron to fall to her knees, to claw at the stone, to beg her king for mercy, for a lesser sentence, for her life. No Omega could survive the severing of a fated bond without completely losing their mind to the grief. No one survived the cursed forest in the dead of winter. It was a death sentence, merely disguised as mercy. She did not break. Aveline anchored herself in the agonizing void of her chest. She focused entirely on the faint, nearly imperceptible double heartbeat drumming beneath her ribs. They were her survival. They were the only future that mattered now. Slowly, meticulously, Aveline drew in a deep breath of the freezing, pine-scented air. She straightened her posture until she was standing taller than she ever had as a queen. She reached up to her throat with steady, untrembling fingers. She unclasped the Winterbane crest. The heavy silver pendant pooled in her palm, completely stripped of its warmth. She did not throw it. She did not hurl it in a fit of melodramatic rage. She simply stepped forward and placed the silver wolf gently onto the cold stone floor of the dais, a quiet, terrifyingly final sound. "I accept your rejection, King Gideon," Aveline said. Her voice was perfectly even. It did not shake. It carried no tears, no hysteria, and no begging. It was the calm, lethal quiet of a frozen lake right before the ice breaks. Gideon flinched, a violent, full-body flinch, as if she had struck him across the jaw with an iron gauntlet. His striking, tempestuous gaze widened slightly, the dead glass film cracking for just a fraction of a second, as the sheer dignity of her voice penetrated the poison. He leaned forward, his mouth parting, a strangled, confused sound catching in his throat. Sibylla was already moving, gesturing sharply to the elite guards. "Escort the traitor to the gates now. Do not touch me." Aveline's command was not loud, but it carried a dense, ancestral authority that made the two approaching guards freeze in their tracks. The ancient magic in her Thorn bloodline, the dormant power she had always kept carefully hidden so as not to outshine her mate, flared briefly in her silver eyes. The guards instinctively lowered their gazes, stepping back. She turned her back on the Iron Throne. She turned her back on the usurper Duchess, on the whispering, vulture-like nobles, and on the man she had loved more than her own life. Every step she took down the length of the cavernous main hall was measured and deliberate. The thin silk slippers offered no protection against the freezing stone, but she did not rush. The crowd parted for her, stepping back into the shadows, unnerved by the absolute silence of her departure. A name unspoken grows teeth, and the silence she left in her wake was already gnawing at the foundations of the room. The heavy iron doors of the keep loomed ahead. Standing before them was Riker Blackwood, the border warden. His thick, fur-lined armor was dusted with snow from his previous patrol, his hand resting heavily on the release lever of the gates. Riker was an honor-bound soldier, a veteran who had fought alongside Gideon and who knew the true heart of the Luna. As she approached, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though his teeth might shatter. He didn't see a traitor. He saw the woman who had sat by his wife's bedside during the winter fever, bathing her brow when the royal healers had refused to venture into the lower wards. Riker's eyes met hers. There was a deep, agonizing sorrow in his gaze. He could not defy a direct order from the Alpha King without initiating a bloodbath, but he refused to completely abandon his honor. When Aveline passed him, Riker bowed his head, a gesture of absolute, unwavering respect that sent a ripple of shocked murmurs through the perimeter guards. "The woods are unforgiving tonight, my Luna," Riker murmured, his voice pitched so low that only her wolf-enhanced hearing could catch it. As he reached to push the heavy iron mechanism, he subtly let his thick woolen mantle slide from his shoulder, leaving it draped over the iron latch right at eye level. A silent offering. "Follow the eastern ridge. There is a hunter's blind 3 miles out. Survive." Aveline did not pause, nor did she speak a word that might implicate him. But as she stepped past the gate mechanism, her hand shot out, seamlessly grabbing the heavy woolen cloak. Her numb, frost-bitten fingertips brushed against the thick, coarse wool, instantly absorbing the trapped, blistering heat of the warden's body. A violent, saving contrast to the marrow-deep chill of the iron gates. The residual warmth from the warden's body was a tiny, vital shield against the encroaching death, pulling her back from the precipice of immediate hypothermia. She pulled it tightly over her trembling shoulders. The heavy iron doors of the keep groaned open, revealing the ferocious blizzard. The wind roared into the hall, biting into her exposed skin with the fury of 1,000 needles, extinguishing the nearby torches in a chaotic flurry of sparks and shadows. The darkness of the ancient timberland stretched out beyond the threshold, a lethal, freezing abyss that promised nothing but a silent death. Aveline stepped over the threshold into the storm. She did not look back. Not at the warmth of the hall, not at the usurper Duchess grinning in the shadows, and not at the poisoned king who sat frozen on his throne. The massive doors slammed shut behind her, the resounding boom echoing like a thunderclap across the snowy peaks. The finality of the sound triggered another violent shudder of the severed mate bond, a phantom bleeding that made her stumble into the knee-deep snows. The cold was immediate, absolute and merciless. It cut through her silk gown in seconds, stinging her face and turning her breath into plumes of thick white smoke. Every step away from the king's stronghold felt like dragging an anchor made of rusted iron. The sacred thread connecting their souls had not just snapped. It had shattered, leaving behind jagged metaphysical shrapnel in her chest. She coughed, a harsh, ragged sound, half expecting to see her own blood splatter against the pristine white snow. There was only the thick, freezing mist of her own breath. The silk slippers she wore were shredded by the jagged ice beneath the snow within the first mile. Aveline left small, blooming roses of dark blood in her wake, but the freezing temperatures quickly numbed the physical pain of her lacerated feet. She pulled the warden's heavy woolen garment tighter around her trembling frame, burying her face into the fur-lined collar to trap her own rapid, shallow breaths. The scent of ozone, ancient pine, and freezing earth filled her lungs. She walked. The blizzard howled through the skeletal trees of the deep frozen pines, tearing at her clothes, desperate to drag her down into the endless white void. The wind sounded like the jeering whispers of the nobles in the grand hall. Treason, execution, Omega. Her wolf whimpered, pacing inside her mind, limping from the catastrophic loss of the mate bond. The space where Gideon's golden, resonant warmth had lived for 3 years was now an open, bleeding crater. A hollow void. Every beat of her heart pumped a phantom freezing ache through her chest. It was the Winterbane curse by proxy, the absolute biological devastation of a severed fated tie. Most wolves would have thrown themselves off the nearest cliff to escape the agony. Aveline did not stop. She focused downward. She focused entirely on the faint, rapid double heartbeat drumming beneath her frozen ribs, the twin pups, Kaelin and Zephyr. They did not have names yet, but she could already feel their distinct, towering presences in her blood. One felt like the heavy, silent weight of a shadow. The other felt like the chaotic, crackling energy of a storm. They were the next generation of the Valdron monarchy. They were the only future that mattered. "I will not let you die," Aveline whispered to the howling wind, her voice completely swallowed by the storm. "I will not let the cold touch you." Her mind briefly flashed back to the cavernous main hall, to Sibylla's triumphant smirk, to the sickeningly sweet scent of poisoned honey and decaying lavender, the mind-altering elixir. Aveline had read of it in the ancient archives, a forbidden concoction brewed from shadow root and dark magic, designed to sever a true mate bond by convincing the host's inner beast that its mate was a lethal threat. Gideon was a prisoner in his own mind, heavily sedated by the usurper's poison. He was currently sitting on an iron throne that was slowly crumbling beneath his own uncontrollable strength, completely blind to the fact that he had just condemned his own bloodline to die in the snow. "He will realize it one day," her wolf murmured, a weak, raspy thought, "and the guilt will tear him apart." Aveline did not care about his future guilt. Guilt could not keep a fire burning. Regret could not feed her children. She reached up with a numb, trembling hand, her fingers brushing the bare skin of her collarbone where the Winterbane crest used to rest. The phantom weight of the heavy silver pendant still lingered, cold and dead. He had sworn no cold would touch her while his heart beat, a lie fabricated by the potion, but a broken promise nonetheless. By the time the 3rd hour passed, her body was shutting down, her vision narrowed to a blurry grey tunnel. The ancient magic in her blood, the dormant, unspoken power of the Thorn lineage, began to stir, fighting back against the encroaching hypothermia. A faint, silver warmth radiated from her core, pushing outward to keep her vital organs functioning, protecting the womb at all costs. It was not enough to keep her comfortable, but it was exactly enough to keep her breathing. 3 miles out, exactly as Riker Blackwood had promised, a jagged silhouette emerged from the blinding white curtain of the blizzard, the hunter's blind. It was a dilapidated, half-sunken wooden structure built against the side of a massive granite boulder. The roof sagged under the weight of accumulated snow, and the wooden door was hanging off a rusted iron hinge. Aveline practically fell through the threshold. The wind instantly lost its biting edge, blocked by the thick logs and stone. She collapsed onto the dry, dusty dirt floor, her knees hitting the ground with a dull thud. The scent inside was old, stale pine and dried earth. It was empty. It was safe. She crawled into the furthest, darkest corner of the small structure. She pulled her bloodied knees to her chest and wrapped Riker's cloak around herself like a cocoon. The adrenaline of the public trial was finally draining away, leaving behind the crushing, suffocating reality of her exile. The king was lost. The pack had discarded her. The bond was dead. In the absolute silence of the hunter's blind, Aveline finally allowed her physical body to react. She did not weep for Gideon Vance. She did not shed a single tear for the man who had let a usurper duchess poison his mind and steal his crown. Her silver eyes glowed faintly in the pitch-black darkness, wide and unblinking. She pressed both hands flat against her lower stomach. The warmth of the dormant magic pulsed beneath her palms. Her wolf, broken and bleeding, curled itself tightly around the two tiny lives, instinctively preparing for a war that would last for years. We are small things in a world of teeth. But the kingdom of Valdrun would eventually learn that the women they banished to the dark were exactly the ones who learned how to rule it. 7 brutal months passed in the deep frost. The exiled wilderness did not care that a queen walked among its jagged, skeletal pines. The forest was a relentless, freezing predator, indifferent to the heavy, swollen belly that altered Aveline Thorne's center of gravity with every labored step she took across the rough-hewn floorboards of her sanctuary. It was a secluded cabin, hidden deep within the treacherous eastern ravines, built from massive, unyielding timber and packed tightly with frozen moss. Nesta Finch, a rogue healer and exiled midwife, had found Aveline shivering in a dilapidated hunter's blind during her first week of banishment and brought her here. Together, the two women had fortified the small structure against the lethal bite of the northern wind. The only warmth Aveline possessed when she arrived was Riker's patrol cloak, the heavy woolen garment the border warden had secretly left for her. Now, 8 months later, it smelled faintly of the Iron Citadel, of cold iron and dying embers. The scent only sharpened the phantom ache in her chest. Survival had become a mechanical, grinding ritual. Aveline wore heavy, cured animal pelts, stitched together with bone needles, her once immaculate silk gowns a forgotten memory of a dead life. Her hands were violently scarred, calloused, and stained permanently with dirt and dried herbs. She had become something primal. She had become a ghost in the snow. The biological toll of the pregnancy was catastrophic. Shifter pregnancies were inherently violent on the mother's body, demanding massive reserves of magic and caloric energy to forge the dense bones and accelerated musculature of an apex predator. Aveline was carrying too. The twins' secondary heartbeats drummed constantly beneath her ribs, frantic and ravenous, draining the dormant ancient magic from her Thorn bloodline, just to keep the three of them breathing. She was perpetually freezing. Her core temperature had dropped so low that she shivered despite sitting directly beside the roaring stone hearth. The phantom void in her chest, the jagged crater where her fated mate bond had been violently amputated, throbbed with a dull, sickening ache. Without Gideon's proximity to regulate her shifting hormones and anchor her physical pain, every day was a brutal exercise in sheer endurance. Gideon Vance was lost to her, his mind shattered by Sibylla Frost's insidious toxin, leaving him blind to the treason that had driven his true mate into the dark. On the 3rd day of the 8th month, the sky beyond the cabin's thick wooden shutters turned a bruised, sickly purple. The barometric pressure plummeted so rapidly that Aveline's ears popped, sending a sharp spike of vertigo through her skull. A squall was coming, not just a winter storm, but a true high-country blizzard, the kind that froze the sap inside the trees and suffocated entire packs under mountains of white. The air tasted heavily of ozone and raw iron. Aveline was standing by the heavy oak table, grinding dried willow bark with a heavy stone pestle when the first contraction hit. It did not build slowly. It was a sudden, apocalyptic tearing sensation that started at the base of her spine and violently ripped through her pelvis, forcing the oxygen from her lungs in a harsh, ragged gasp. Aveline dropped the stone pestle. It struck the floorboards with a heavy thud. Her knees buckled. She slammed hard onto the rough wood, her scarred hands instinctively flying to cradle her swollen abdomen beneath the veteran's heavy mantle. The pain was absolute. It was a blinding, white-hot agony that completely eclipsed the ambient warmth of the hearth fire. Her wolf whimpered, thrashing blindly in the dark recesses of her mind, utterly terrified by the premature onset of labor. It was too soon. They were not ready. Outside, the freezing wind began to howl, violently rattling the iron hinges of the cabin doors. She breathed in. She held it. The contraction peaked, holding her body hostage in an iron grip of biological necessity, before slowly receding into a dull, terrifying throb. Aveline did not scream. She forced her spine straight, dragging herself upright by gripping the edge of the heavy table. Nesta Finch emerged from the small adjoining storeroom, her arms full of dried firewood. The older woman took one look at Aveline's pale, sweat-slicked face and dropped the wood. The heavy logs clattered across the floor. Nesta was a woman who had seen the worst of shifter society, her face deeply lined with the harsh realities of exile, but her pale eyes widened in sheer alarm. Moon Goddess, the raspy, aged voice breathed. Nesta crossed the room in 3 rapid strides, her hands moving with practiced, lightning-fast efficiency. "You are early, child. Too early. Help them," Aveline gritted out. Her breathing was a metronomic hiss through clenched teeth. The words were a command, not a plea. Though covered in sweat and shaking in the dim light of a secluded cabin, her voice carried the heavy, undeniable authority of a sovereign. Nesta did not argue. She guided Aveline to the thick pallet of furs near the roaring hearth, easing the agonizing mother onto her back. The midwife shrugged off her heavy leather satchel, ripping it open to pull out bundles of dried herbs and tightly sealed glass vials. "If you push now, your heart will stop. You are freezing from the inside out." Aveline bit down hard on the heavy leather collar of the protective wool fabric, the taste of old iron and copper instantly flooding her mouth as her teeth pierced her own lip. She stared blankly at the heavy timber ceiling, her silver eyes glowing faintly, locking all her agony behind a wall of impenetrable, frozen stoicism. Nesta pulled a handful of pale, papery strips from her satchel. Luna birch bark. It was a rare, highly potent analgesic that only grew in the highest, most lethal altitudes of the northern peaks. She quickly packed a dented iron cup with snow from a bucket by the door, set it directly over the glowing embers of the hearth, and dropped the bark into the melting water. "Drink this," Nesta ordered minutes later, pressing the scorching iron rim to Aveline's bleeding lips. "It will numb the tearing. It will keep your wolf from panicking." Aveline swallowed the boiling, bitter liquid without flinching. It tasted like ash and ozone. Almost instantly, a heavy, numbing cold spread outward from her stomach, temporarily muting the violent, white-hot spikes of the contractions. It did not stop the labor, but it gave her back control of her own muscles. The searing ache of the severed, fated mate bond dimmed, replaced entirely by the primal, biological urge to bring her pups into the world. "I am going to need you to push," Nesta said, her voice entirely stripped of bedside manner. It was the voice of a survivor speaking to another survivor. "The first one is crowning. He is massive." Aveline braced her heavy boots against the stone lip of the hearth. She gripped the thick furs beneath her, digging her fingers so deeply into the pelts that her nails cracked. She pushed. The physical mechanics of the birth were a blur of blood, sweat, and primal instinct. The cabin echoed with the harsh, ragged sound of Aveline's breathing, but she never screamed. She refused to give the pain a voice. The void in her chest pulsed, a phantom biological alarm, screaming that her mate was missing, that she was unprotected, that she was vulnerable to the predators in the woods. She violently silenced the instinct. She was her own anchor now. She was the shield. "Almost," Nesta coaxed, her hands slick with blood in the warm, flickering light. "One more." "Break the ice, Mother. Bring him through. With a final, earth-shattering surge of physical force, the first twin was born. There was no immediate crying. Instead, a heavy, suffocating pressure instantly filled the small cabin. The shadows dancing on the timber walls seemed to detach themselves, leaning inward, gravitating toward the tiny, writhing form in Nesta's hands. The air grew instantly colder. The damp edges of the wooden floorboards frosted over. Nesta gasped, nearly dropping the infant. "What is this?" Aveline pushed herself up onto her elbows, her silver eyes locking onto her firstborn, Kaelin. The boy was covered in blood and amniotic fluid, but his eyes were already open. They were wide, unblinking pools of pure, molten silver, an exact replica of his mother's ancient lineage. The shadows clung to his tiny skin like a second blanket, viscous and cold. He did not weep. He simply watched the dark. Before Nesta could fully process the anomaly, the fourth contraction hit Aveline, more violent and erratic than all the others combined. The cabin itself seemed to shudder. The thick oak logs groaned under a sudden immense atmospheric pressure. "The second is coming," Nesta shouted over a sudden, inexplicable rush of wind that swept down the stone chimney. The hearth fire flared wildly, turning from orange to a bright, crackling blue. Aveline screamed then, not from pain, but from the sheer raw effort of channeling the erratic, explosive magic tearing through her womb. The air pressure dropped so violently that Nesta's ears popped again. Static electricity arched across the heavy wooden beams of the ceiling, raising the fine hairs on Aveline's arms. Zephyr arrived in a chaotic burst of ozone and thunder. The moment the second twin cleared the birth canal, he let out a wail that sounded exactly like a cracking whip of lightning. The gust of wind that accompanied his first breath physically pushed Nesta backward, sending her medical satchel skittering across the floor. Zephyr was slightly smaller than his brother, but his energy was uncontrollable, his eyes a terrifying, turbulent, silver-clouded hue that sparked with latent elemental fury. Gideon's eyes. Nesta scrambled forward on her knees, completely terrified by the sheer magnitude of what she had just delivered. She reached into her boot and pulled out her most prized possession, a heavy iron blade, forged by the old covens, designed specifically to cut the umbilical cords of high-born shifters without transferring infection. She sliced the cords. The moment the cold iron separated the twins from their mother, the magic in the room stabilized, settling heavily into the two infants. The howling wind in the chimney died. The shadows retreated to the corners of the cabin. Nesta wiped the blood from the twins' backs, her breath catching in her throat. She stared down at the tiny, fragile shoulder blades of the newborns. "Mother of moons," the old woman whispered, her hands trembling violently. Aveline collapsed back against the furs, completely hollowed out, her body trembling with postpartum shock. Her scarred hands twitched. "What is it?" "They are marked," Nesta breathed, wrapping the infants in warm wool and holding them close to Aveline's face. Both of them. Aveline forced her heavy, exhausted eyelids open. There, glowing faintly against the pale skin of both boys' left shoulders, were intricate, swirling crests of pure magic. Kaelin's mark was pitch black, a vortex of shadow that seemed to swallow the light around it. Zephyr's mark was a brilliant, crackling silver, resembling a jagged bolt of lightning wrapped around a wolf's skull. Dual alpha marks, an absolute biological impossibility. A pack could only have one true alpha, one dominant soul born to command. To have two born from the same womb, carrying the ancient, volatile magic of the Thorn lineage and the ferocious blood of the Vance kings, was a cosmic declaration of war. They were not just heirs, they were apex predators wrapped in infant skin. Aveline reached out a trembling, blood-stained finger. She traced the black crest on Kaelin's shoulder, then the silver crest on Zephyr's. The phantom ache in her chest, the agonizing void left by Gideon's severed bond, finally fell quiet, entirely eclipsed a terrifying, all-consuming wave of maternal protective fury. "Conceal them," Aveline whispered to the roaring fire, her voice a lethal freezing vow. "Keep them hidden until they are strong enough to take it all." Outside, the wind howled across the frozen peaks, carrying the scent of snow and pine across the silent valley. 5 winters came and went, burying the past beneath mountains of unmelting snow. The passage of half a decade in the exiled wilderness was measured not by calendars, but by the thickening rings of the ancient pines and the slow, methodical accumulation of survival skills. The secluded cabin had evolved from a desperate shelter into a sprawling, heavily fortified stronghold. It was an architectural marvel of rogue engineering, completely invisible from the valley below, accessible only through a treacherous, winding goat path that Aveline had rigged with lethal deadfall traps. Inside, the environment was a stark, aggressive contrast to the freezing abyss outside. The air was thick and heavy, smelling intensely of roasting venison, drying lavender, and the sharp, clean scent of split cedar. The massive stone hearth dominated the central room, its fire roaring continuously, casting a warm, golden glow across the heavy fur rugs and hand-carved wooden furniture. This was their sanctuary, the ultimate sensory thaw after years of freezing isolation. Aveline had become a master of the unseen. Her body had fully recovered from the catastrophic trauma of the premature birth, hardening into something lean, lethal, and permanently vigilant. Her dark hair was braided tightly against her scalp, and her movements possessed the silent, calculated economy of a woman who expected an ambush at every passing second. She no longer wore the delicate silks of a Luna. She wore heavy, boiled leather armor, her heavy iron blade, gifted by Nestor before the old midwife passed away peacefully in their 3rd winter, strapped securely to her thigh. But her absolute focus, her entire reason for drawing breath, was centered entirely on the 2 dangerous figures currently standing in the center of the cabin's wooden floor. Kaelin and Zephyr were only 5 years old by the calendar, but the rules of ordinary men did not apply to them. The heavy, volatile alpha blood in their veins, combined with the dormant magic of the Thorn lineage, had already driven them through their first shift at an impossibly young age. That primal transformation had drastically accelerated their physical development, demanding massive reserves of magic to forge dense bone and corded muscle. Now, they stood as tall as boys on the precipice of their teenage years, their young shoulders already broad and shaped with the unnatural musculature of adolescent wolves. They were terrifyingly beautiful, carrying the aristocratic, high-cheekboned features of Gideon Vance, yet hardened by the feral, untamed wildness of their mother's survival. It was a cruel irony that Gideon's royal blood ran so fiercely in the sons he did not know existed. Kaelin stood perfectly still in the shadows near the back wall. His silver eyes, the exact mirrored reflection of Aveline's, were completely devoid of emotion. He was the silent brother, the brooding watcher. When he breathed, the shadows in the corners of the cabin seemed to stretch and pulse in tandem with his lungs. Zephyr, in contrast, was entirely incapable of stillness. He paced the length of the worn floorboards, his turbulent slate-colored irises sparking with latent, chaotic energy. Every time his boot struck the floor, a faint crackle of static electricity arched across the wood. The wind outside the cabin seemed to howl in direct response to his agitation, violently rattling the thick wooden shutters. "Again," Aveline commanded, her voice cutting through the heavy tension in the room. She sat on a low wooden bench, a long, unyielding iron oak log resting across her lap. It was a massive piece of timber, carved from the heartwood of a cursed tree, designed not for building, but for testing the absolute physical and mental restraint of the wielder. Zephyr stopped pacing. He turned, his jaw clenched, and snatched the heavy iron oak log from his brother's hands. He planted his boots, gripping the thick, unyielding wood. He pulled, attempting to snap it in half with pure brute force. The muscles in his back bunched and strained against his leather tunic. The log did not splinter. Zephyr's frustration flared, immediate and explosive. A sharp gust of wind materialized inside the sealed cabin, blowing the hearth fire sideways and sending a cloud of hot ash into the air. "Control it," Aveline snapped, standing up so fast the bench scraped harshly against the floor. She closed the distance between them, her silver eyes flashing with absolute authority. If you lose your temper, you lose your cover. If you lose your cover, Sitzbila Frost's hunters will find us, and they will not hesitate to put a silver bolt through your heart. Let them come, Zephyr snarled, the static electricity in his hair standing on end. I can break their bones with the wind before they cross the tree line. Arrogance is how predators die, Zephyr, Aveline said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. She reached out, her scarred hand wrapping over his knuckles, physically forcing him to lower the timber. You are not a god. You are a boy with a target on your back. You must learn to be prey, so they do not hunt you. From the shadows, Kaelan moved. He did not step forward. He simply appeared beside them, the darkness bending around his physical form like a liquid shroud. He reached out and took the iron oak log from Zephyr's rigid grip. Kaelan did not use anger. He closed his silver eyes, his chest rising in a slow, calculated breath. The shadows in the room instantly rushed toward him, wrapping around his forearms, acting as a secondary set of spectral muscles. He twisted the thick wood. The cursed iron oak groaned in protest, bending inch by agonizing inch until the fibers finally began to snap under the immense pressure of the darkness. He held it there for 10 full seconds, perfect, terrifying stillness. Then he slowly released the tension, handing the splintered log back to his mother. Better, Aveline said, nodding strictly to her eldest. But you relied on the shadows. If you use your magic in the lower valleys, the border wardens will smell the ozone and decay. They will track the signature. A name unspoken for 5 years grows teeth, and the name of Gideon Vance still gnawed relentlessly at the edges of Aveline's sanity. The Alpha King was still out there, entirely consumed by the madness of the soul fracture potion, ruling a decaying kingdom that was slowly collapsing without its true Luna. Aveline had heard the rumors from the rogue traders who occasionally braved the high passes. The royal bastion was failing. The packs were starving. The king was tearing his own throne room apart, hunting for ghosts. She could not afford a single mistake. She could not let her sons become the targets of a mad king's paranoia or Sibylla Frost's poisoned honey. Sit, Aveline ordered, gesturing to the heavy wooden table near the hearth. The boys obeyed instantly. Despite their formidable strength and their volatile alpha instincts, they submitted entirely to her. She was their mother, their general, and their absolute anchor. Aveline walked to the mantel and retrieved a small, heavy leather pouch. She loosened the drawstrings, pouring the contents onto the rough-hewn table. Heavy iron stones. There were dozens of them, small, jagged pieces of cold iron, each painstakingly carved with ancient, binding sigils from the Thorn lineage. Kaelan and Zephyr both grimaced, their young shoulders tensing defensively. They hated this part of the routine. "Shirts off," Aveline commanded softly, her maternal heart aching while her face remained completely stoic. The boys stripped off their leather tunics, revealing the dual alpha marks glowing faintly on their left shoulder blades. Kaelan's black vortex and Zephyr's silver lightning bolt. The sheer density of the pheromones and raw power radiating from the marks was staggering, enough to choke a normal wolf. If they stepped outside the cabin without suppression, every alpha within 50 miles would sense the challenge. Aveline picked up the first iron stone. She held it directly over the roaring flames of the hearth until the carved metal began to glow with a dull, angry red heat. Not used. Not owned. Chosen. Aveline whispered the ancient binding incantation, her voice thick with sorrow. She turned and pressed the burning, red-hot iron stone directly into the center of Kaelan's black alpha mark. The hiss of burning flesh filled the quiet cabin. Kaelan's entire frame went rigid. The veins in his neck bulged, his jaw locking so tightly the bones cracked, but he did not make a single sound. The shadows in the room violently recoiled, shrinking away from the binding magic. The hot iron melted into his skin, sealing the massive, suffocating aura of his alpha scent behind a wall of ancient, suppressing magic. Aveline quickly repeated the process, heating a second stone and pressing it into Zephyr's silver crest. Zephyr grunted, a low, guttural sound of pure agony, a sharp gust of wind knocking a wooden bowl off the table before his storm magic was violently slammed back into its cage. When the ritual was complete, the heavy, oppressive pressure in the cabin vanished. The boys smelled like nothing but pine, sweat, and wood smoke. They smelled human. They smelled weak. Aveline dropped the cooling iron stones onto the table. Her hands were shaking. The physical burning of her son's flesh was a trauma she forced herself to endure every single month, a brutal, necessary cruelty to keep them hidden from the world of teeth waiting below. She stepped forward, pulling both of her trembling sons against her chest. Kaelin buried his face into her shoulder, his stoicism finally cracking in the safety of her arms. Zephyr wrapped his arms around her waist, breathing heavily, grounding his chaotic energy in her steady, unyielding heartbeat. "I am sorry," Aveline whispered into their hair, her silver eyes staring fiercely over their shoulders into the dark corner of the cabin. "I am so sorry I have to cage you." She held them tightly, her maternal protective fury burning brighter than the hearth fire. She was hiding them now. She was forcing them to be unseen, but she knew, with the absolute certainty of an ancient bloodline, that suppression was only temporary. The iron stones would not hold forever. The shadows were growing too thick. The storms were growing too wild. The sprawling timberland could not contain them much longer, and when the day finally came for the twins to descend, the sovereign fortress would not be prepared for the vengeance of the ghosts they had buried in the snow. Miles away, the howling wind of the high country blizzard slowly faded into the hollow, echoing drip of freezing water against ancient stone. The dungeons were where you went to be forgotten. But for Alpha King Gideon Vance, the entire ancestral keep had become a freezing, inescapable cage of his own making. The once impregnable fortress of Valdron was actively dying. For 6 brutal winters, the pack had suffered a slow, suffocating decline. The grand harvest fires burned low, producing only pale, anemic smoke that offered absolutely zero warmth to the shivering guards stationed along the battlements. The crops in the lower valleys had frozen solid in the soil, refusing to yield life, no matter how much blood was poured into the earth. The ancient territorial magic of the northern peaks was systematically rejecting a sovereign who ruled without his fated mate. A king without a Luna was a king walking with half a soul. The land recognized the agonizing void. It responded with endless, punishing frost. Gideon's physical deterioration was terrifying to witness. He had not slept more than 3 consecutive hours in 6 years. His towering, muscular frame was corded with severe, unhealthy tension, his broad shoulders perpetually hunched, as if bearing the physical weight of a collapsing sky. His once piercing gaze was heavily bloodshot, surrounded by deep bruised shadows that made his cheekbones look like sharp ridges of carved marble. He prowled the empty, freezing corridors of the keep at midnight, a restless ghost haunting his own halls. Driven entirely mad by an instinctual itch he could not scratch, his inner beast was suffocating, but it was no longer sedated. The treacherous elixir was a potent, insidious chemical cage, but the ancient Vance bloodline was not meant to be contained indefinitely by a dark, viscous liquid that mimicked the physical feeling of a dying bond. Over the course of 6 grueling years, Gideon's biology had begun to aggressively adapt. The false, chemically induced paranoia that had clouded his mind on the day of the banishment was beginning to crack. It was slowly being replaced by sudden, violent flashes of sensory clarity that left him gasping for air in the dark. The phantom scent of a severed bond kept waking him in a freezing sweat, his massive hands clawing at his own chest as if trying to rip the phantom iron hook from his ribs. On the night of the winter solstice, Gideon found himself standing alone in the desolate East Wing. These were the former quarters of Sibylla Frost, abandoned when the usurper Duchess had boldly moved herself into the royal wing to cement her absolute political dominance over the crumbling court. The room was draped in heavy canvas dust covers, completely dark save for the pale, razor-thin moonlight bleeding through the frosted glass. Gideon did not know why his heavy boots had carried him here. His wolf was pacing frantically against the inside of his ribs, growling a low, continuous vibration of pure, unfiltered hostility that rattled his very teeth. Then he smelled it. It was incredibly faint, masked heavily by years of stale air and the freezing ambient draft, but to an apex predator's heightened senses, it was as loud as a ringing iron bell, poisoned honey and decaying lavender. The exact olfactory signature that had choked the air in the cavernous main hall on the day his entire world shattered. The scent hit the back of Gideon's throat, immediately triggering a violent, involuntary wave of nausea. His pupil dilation was instantaneous. The storm grey of his irises darkened into something completely feral and unhinged. He followed the sickly, sweet aroma, his massive boots making zero sound against the freezing stone floor. He stopped directly in front of a heavy oak armoire. The scent was seeping from the solid granite wall behind it. Gideon did not look for a hidden lever. He did not search the floorboards for a key. He simply raised his scarred, calloused fist and punched directly through the ancient masonry. The granite shattered. A violent, concussive crack echoed through the desolate corridor. A cloud of grey dust and powdered mortar exploded outward, coating his dark tunic in a layer of pale ash. He reached into the jagged, bleeding hole, entirely ignoring the sharp, broken edges of the masonry that sliced open the flesh of his knuckles. Warm, raw blood dripped down his wrist, pooling on the floorboards. The physical pain did not even register. His fingers searched the dark hollow, closing around cold, unyielding iron. He ripped a heavy, lead-lined lockbox from the wall. The rusted iron hinges of its hidden compartment shrieked in protest, raining rust flakes over his boots, before he threw the entire container onto the dusty floorboards. The lock snapped upon impact, the metal warping under the sheer kinetic force. Gideon dropped heavily to one knee. He flipped the warped lid open. Inside lay a thick parchment ledger that bound in crimson leather, containing fabricated evidence of Avelin's treason. The forged ledger. The very book that had condemned his fated mate to the freezing wastes. But this was not the final flawless copy Sibylla had presented to the court. These were the raw, meticulous drafts. The pages were covered in the usurper's jagged handwriting, practicing Aveline's flawless signature hundreds of times, crossing out failed attempts, calculating the exact dates to fabricate the treasonous meetings. It was a blueprint for absolute ruin. Beneath the forged ledger, resting on a bed of plush black velvet, was a heavy silver ring set with a fractured dark stone. Gideon recognized the ornate silver banding instantly. It was the jewelry Sibylla had worn on her right hand every single morning for 6 years, flashing in the firelight when she served him his restorative tea. He picked it up with trembling, blood-stained fingers, the cold metal biting into his skin. His thumb brushed a microscopic, perfectly concealed latch on the underside of the heavy silver band. With a sharp, mechanical click, the massive dark stone shifted backward on a tiny hinge, revealing a hollowed-out reservoir inside. The scent of poisoned honey hit him like a physical blow to the jaw. The residual traces of the biological poison. The truth did not arrive slowly. It violently detonated in his mind. The chemical cage built by the mind-altering brew shattered completely, entirely incinerated by the absolute, horrific realization of his own actions. And the exact moment the potion's numbing effect vanished, the biological reality of the severed fated mate bond crashed into him with 6 years of backlogged agony. Gideon screamed. It was not a human sound. It was the raw, guttural roar of a dying beast. He collapsed forward onto his hands and knees, his massive frame convulsing as the phantom frost in his chest violently transformed into a jagged, burning crater, the sacred thread woven between their souls, stretching, tearing, bleeding. He felt it now. He felt the exact physiological moment he had spoken the words of banishment. He felt the metaphysical iron hook rip half of his soul from his body. He retched dryly, his vision swimming with dark, suffocating spots. The physical burning of the severed mark was an agonizing, inescapable fire that cooked his blood from the inside out. He clawed frantically at his own chest, tearing through the thick fabric of his tunic, his blunt nails leaving deep, bloody furrows over his heart. He had banished her. He had looked into her rare silver eyes, blinded by a usurper's poison, and he had thrown his absolute salvation into a howling blizzard. Aveline, Gideon gasped, coughing on the dust and his own saliva. A name unspoken for 6 years grows teeth, and it bit directly into his windpipe. He remembered the trial, the memory, previously distorted by the chemical paranoia, now played back with agonizing, cinematic clarity. She had not cried. She had not begged for his mercy. She had stood perfectly still, her spine a rod of forged steel, and she had accepted his cruelty with a frozen dignity that now made him want to rip his own throat out. She had left the Winterbane crest behind on the Stone's Ace, walking away from a kingdom that did not deserve her grace. He forced himself upward. The Alpha King did not just stand. He rose like a tidal wave of pure, apocalyptic violence. The ambient temperature in the East Wing plummeted by 20 degrees. Spidery patterns of ice webbed rapidly across the stone walls, a physical manifestation of his unleashed, unhinged power. He grabbed the forged ledger and the heavy silver ring. He wanted to stalk directly into the royal wing. He wanted to drag Sibzila Frost from her velvet bed, shatter her spine against the executioner's dais, and paint the ancient stone floor of the grand hall with her blood. The beast inside him roared for immediate, brutal retribution, but the sovereign intellect of the Vance bloodline violently overrode the primal urge. A public execution would satisfy his rage, but it would not mend his soul. If he killed Sibylla now, the court would shatter into chaotic factions, and the borders would become entirely impassable. He could not afford a civil war, not when his fated mate was still lost in the dark. Sibylla Frost would remain in her stolen chambers. She would continue to sit in the royal wing, utterly oblivious to the fact that her death had already been written in the shadows. He would let the usurper Duchess believe she still held the reins of the decaying keep. He needed to find Aveline first. He needed to drag himself through the snow and beg for a forgiveness he did not deserve. Gideon turned away from the door that led to the grand hall. He moved through the freezing, hidden servants' corridors, a terrifying phantom of a king, heading directly downward into the absolute depths of the fortress. The war room was a heavy, suffocating chamber of black iron and dark wood, lit only by a single, dying hearth fire. The shadows clung to the corners like waiting vultures, watching the broken sovereign pace. Gideon stood over the massive central table. Spread across the rough-hewn oak was a sprawling, thick parchment, charting the lethal eastern territories. The topographical lines were marked in faded black ink and old blood, detailing the jagged ravines and impassable peaks of the borderlands. His massive hands were planted firmly on the edges of the parchment. He was bleeding. The deep furrows he had clawed into his own chest were seeping raw blood, staining his dark tunic, but he did not feel the physical pain. It was entirely eclipsed by the agonizing, biological void of the severed bond tearing through his marrow. Resting on the center of the heavy parchment, directly over the dark ink that marked the eastern wilds, was his own ruined regalia. He stared at the jagged topographical lines, his storm-grey eyes frantic, desperate, searching for a ghost. The heavy iron door groaned open. Riker Blackwood stepped into the dim light. The border warden had aged significantly over the past 6 years. His beard was heavily threaded with grey, and the harsh, deep lines around his eyes spoke of countless brutal winters patrolling a decaying border. He wore his heavy woolen armor, but he did not salute. He did not bow. His respect for the Alpha King had died on the exact same night the Luna was banished. "You summoned me, Sovereign," Riker said, his voice flat, completely devoid of any subservient warmth. Gideon did not look up immediately. He traced the lines of the eastern ridge on the thick animal hide, his bloodied fingertips smearing red across the ancient parchment. The ledger was forged, Gideon gritted out, every syllable sounding exactly like ground glass tearing his throat. "The poison in my tea blinded my wolf. Sibylla orchestrated it all. She severed my mind from my soul." Riker did not show a single ounce of surprise. He simply just stood with a straight spine, his calloused hands resting heavily on the pommel of his sword. I always knew the truth would eventually bite through the lies, but the truth does not bring the dead back to life. Gideon finally looked up. His storm-grey eyes were haunted, shining with a desperate, frantic hunger. He stepped around the heavy table, closing the physical distance between them. The King of Valdron was terrifying, a towering apex predator, but as he stopped in front of the aging warden, all his sovereign authority vanished into the freezing air. He looked entirely broken. "Where did she go, Riker?" Gideon asked, his voice cracking, a rough, desperate whisper. "The night I sent her away, you were at the gates. Tell me exactly what happened. Do not omit a single breath." Riker's jaw clenched. He looked away, staring into the dying embers in the hearth. The memory of that night was a heavy scar the veteran carried deep in his own chest. "I could not defy a direct order," Riker said slowly, his tone cautious. "If I had fought you, the guards would have slaughtered her on the dais. But I did not let her walk into the dark empty-handed." Gideon's chest hitched. He stopped breathing. "What did you do?" "I gave her my cloak." The border warden confessed, his pale eyes snapping back to meet the Sovereign's frantic gaze. He had defied the Sovereign mandate that night, choosing compassion over duty. He had left Riker's patrol cloak on the iron latch. "I told her to follow the eastern ridge. I told her there was a hunter's blind 3 miles out into the lethally cold forest. It was the only shelter before the deep peaks." Gideon spun back to the table. His bloodied fingers stabbed down onto the thick parchment, locating the exact coordinate of the old, dilapidated structure. 3 miles, 3 miles in a blinding blizzard. "She made it," Gideon said, the words rushing out in a frantic, manic breath. A terrifying spark of hope flared in his chest, fighting fiercely against the crushing weight of his guilt. "She is strong, Riker, her lineage. She survives. She made it to the blind. I will send the trackers. I will ride out tonight. I will. Gideon." It was the first time in 10 years the warden had used the given name without a formal title. The absolute severity in Riker's tone brought Gideon to a dead, freezing halt. Riker stepped forward, his weathered face filled with a heavy, uncompromising sorrow. He looked at the Alpha King, not as a ruler, but as a man who desperately needed to understand the lethal mathematics of his own tragic mistake. "You sent her into a high-country blizzard," Riker said, his voice dropping into a harsh, unforgiving register. "She was wearing thin silk slippers. She had no provisions, no fire starter, and the ambient temperature that night was enough to freeze the sap solid in the pines. My cloak was heavy, but it was not magic." Gideon stepped backward, shaking his head, his hands raising in an instinctual gesture of denial. "No, no. She is breathing. I would know if she was gone. My heart still beats." "Your bond was severed," Riker countered, striking the fatal blow with stoic, clinical precision. "You would not feel her passing. I rode out to the hunter's blind the following spring, when the ice finally thawed. The roof had caved in under the weight of the snow. It was completely empty. The blizzards in that accursed timberland do not leave survivors. You cast her out to die, and the forest obliged. The words were an execution. They did not just hurt. They systematically dismantled the last remaining pillar of Gideon's sanity. The realization of the absolute, catastrophic scale of his failure slammed into him. The physical agony of the severed mark flared so violently that his knees completely gave out. The Alpha King collapsed. He did not merely fall, his biology completely gave out. He hit the freezing stone floor of the war room, his heavy iron-shod boots scraping harshly against the uneven masonry. He made zero effort to catch himself, allowing the sheer, crushing gravity of his absolute guilt to pull him down into the dark. Gideon Vance, the most feared sovereign in the Northern Realms, a man who had slaughtered entire rogue packs without blinking, folded his massive frame forward until his forehead rested heavily against the freezing stone. He began to weep. It was not a quiet, dignified sorrow. It was a raw, biological devastation. His massive shoulders shook violently, harsh, ragged sobs tearing from his throat. completely obliterating the stoic, terrifying facade he had maintained for his entire life. The grovelling was absolute. He was a king brought entirely to ruin by his own mandate, weeping in the dust of his decaying keep, begging the unfeeling stones for a second chance that he did not deserve. Riker Blackwood did not offer comfort. He did not reach down to help the fallen monarch up. The veteran simply watched, bearing silent witness as the sovereign finally paid the emotional toll for his blindness. "I killed her," Gideon gasped between jagged breaths, his scarred hands gripping his own hair, as if trying to physically tear the memories from his skull. The phantom frost in his chest was now a raging inferno of regret. I tore the thread. I sent her into the cold. For several long, agonizing minutes, the only sound in the war room was the desperate, broken weeping of a king who had lost his entire world. Then, something shifted. It was not a sound, but a profound alteration in the atmospheric pressure of the keep. A heavy, vibrating hum echoed through the ancient stones beneath Gideon's knees. The dying embers in the hearth violently flared, turning from a dull orange to a blinding, crackling white. The temperature in the room plummeted further, but it was not the suffocating chill of the Winterbane curse. This was a wild, untamed cold, a storm wind that tasted heavily of ozone, raw lightning, and deep, shifting shadows. A massive surge of primal magic rolled over the northern borderlands and crashed directly into the keep. Gideon's weeping ceased instantly, his inner wolf, completely hollowed out by grief just a second prior, suddenly slammed its front paws against his ribs, howling with a violent, possessive frenzy. The severed mark on his chest did not heal, but the burning agony momentarily paused, numbed by the sheer terrifying proximity of a bloodline resonance. It was a magic he did not recognize, wild and ancient, yet it carried the faint, unmistakable undertone of silver and snow. Gideon slowly lifted his head. His silvery dark irises were swimming in tears, but beneath the absolute devastation, a terrifying, unyielding obsession began to harden like cooling steel. He reached up, his trembling, blood-stained fingers gripping the edge of the heavy oak table. He pulled himself upward, his muscles straining against the sheer weight of his grief. He looked down at the thick parchment, charting the Eastern Territories. "You are wrong," Gideon whispered. The sound was completely devoid of all warmth, hollowed out entirely by pain, yet vibrating with an absolute terrifying conviction. "She is not dead." Riker sighed, a heavy, tired sound that echoed in the cold room. "You cannot undo a severed thread, Gideon. Grief is playing tricks on your beast." "Then I will bleed until I find the end of it," Gideon declared, his voice dropping into a deadly, gravelly rumble. He snatched a rusted iron dagger from the table and drove it directly into the thick animal hide, pinning the parchment exactly over the dark ink of the Whispering Woods. "I feel it. The shadows are moving. The storm is waking. I will tear down every skeletal pine in that forest. I will sift through the snow with my bare hands. I will find her, Riker. Even if I have to crawl across the ice to do it." The border warden simply bowed his head, offering a silent prayer for the madness of a broken king. Gideon Vance did not know that his frantic, desperate search would lead him not to a lonely grave, but to a violent collision with an ancient magic that had already learned exactly how to survive without him. Back in the Whispering Woods, the secluded cabin had withstood 6 grueling years of blizzards, isolation, and the relentless, freezing hostility of the northern peaks. It was an architectural fortress of heavy timber and stone, built to keep the world out. But on the night of the winter solstice, the true threat to the structure was not the howling wind outside. It was the apocalyptic pressure building from within. The air inside the main room was suffocating. The massive stone hearth, usually roaring with a comforting golden heat, was actively being choked out. The flames flickered erratically, starved of oxygen, turning a sickly, pale blue before dying down to mere embers. The ambient temperature was locked in a violent, chaotic war. In the corners of the room, spidery patterns of black frost crawled across the heavy logs, freezing the ambient moisture into jagged shards of ice. Yet, in the center of the floorboards, The wood was completely scorched, smoking faintly from an intense, localized heat. Aveline Thorn stood pressed against the far wall, her spine perfectly straight, her silver eyes glowing with an intense, unblinking vigilance. She did not interfere. She could not. In the center of the room, Kaelin and Zephyr were on their knees. Chronologically, the twins were only 6 years old. But over those 6 brutal winters, the terrifying, biological mandate of the Vance bloodline, combined with the ancient, volatile territorial magic of the Thorn lineage, had demanded a physical toll. Their bodies could not house such immense power as mere children. To survive the lethal surges of their own magic, their cellular structure had been forced into a state of hyper-accelerated maturity. Month by month, the raw elemental energy had forged denser bones and accelerated their musculature, preparing them for this exact moment. Now, the dual alpha marks they bore demanded vessels capable of wielding such apocalyptic power, pushing them through the ultimate physical threshold. They were fully grown now. They possessed the towering, muscular frames of adult warriors, their broad shoulders corded with dense, unnatural strength. They were apex predators, trapped in the agonizing throes of their final alpha ascension. The binding iron stones, the jagged pieces of cold metal Aveline had used every single month to suppress their raw pheromones, were failing. Pressed directly into the glowing marks on their left shoulder blades, the heavy iron objects were no longer a dull red. They were burning with a blinding, white-hot intensity. The ancient suppressing sigils, carved into the metal, were physically cracking under the sheer, unadulterated force of the twins' inner beasts fighting for absolute dominance. "Hold the line," Aveline commanded, her voice slicing through the heavy, static-charged air. It was a harsh, unyielding order. She offered no soft maternal comfort. Comfort would get them killed. Master the beast. Do not let it master you. Kaelin's head was thrown back, his jaw locked in a silent scream. His throat worked furiously, the veins bulging against his pale skin, but he refused to make a sound. The black vortex tattooed into his flesh was actively rejecting the hot iron. Viscous, ink-like shadows poured from his skin, wrapping around his muscular torso like a secondary armor. The darkness was freezing, leaching the ambient heat from the room. The binding iron stones on his back hissed violently, glowing brighter and brighter until the metal began to warp and melt, dripping down his spine like molten lava. He did not flinch from the burn. His silver eyes were rolled back, lost in the chaotic, instinctual integration of his shadow wolf. Beside him, Zephyr was losing the battle for stillness. The Storm Alpha's body convulsed, his hands gripping the edges of the heavy oak table so tightly that the thick wood groaned and splintered beneath his calloused fingers. A crackle of pure, blue static electricity arched across his broad back. The silver lightning bolt crest on his shoulder flared with blinding brilliance. The suppression stone holding his magic suddenly popped, fracturing into 3 distinct pieces of jagged, useless metal. The second the suppression broke, the ascension hit its absolute peak. Zephyr roared. It was a terrifying, earth-shattering sound that completely drowned out the blizzard outside. It was the roar of a sovereign beast claiming its territory, a sonic boom of raw, elemental fury. Simultaneously, Kaelin's shadow magic violently shattered the remaining melted iron on his back, releasing a shockwave of suffocating, absolute darkness. The dual ascension detonated, the sheer kinetic force of the magic expanding outward physically through Aveline back against the timber wall. The heavy oak table shattered into kindling. The iron hinges of the cabin doors shrieked in protest, but the true impact was not physical. It was metaphysical. A towering, invisible pillar of black shadows and crackling silver lightning shot directly upward, passing effortlessly through the heavy roof of the cabin, piercing the dense cloud cover of the winter storm, and radiating outward across the frozen expanse of the endless tree line. 10 miles away, at the jagged edge of the tree line, the border of the sovereign lands was marked by a series of ancient, runic monoliths. These were the boundary stones, erected centuries ago to ward off rogue beasts and delineate the sovereign territory of Valdren. Riker Blackwood stood in the elevated watchtower overlooking the perimeter. The aging border warden had his heavy woolen cloak wrapped tightly around his shoulders, his weathered eyes scanning the relentless white curtain of the blizzard. The night was bitter, the kind of cold that settled deep into the marrow and made the bones ache. For 6 years, Riker had lived with the secret of his treason, knowing that he had given Aveline his own patrol cloak and sent her into the woods instead of executing her, as King Gideon had unknowingly demanded under the influence of a poisoned mind. Then, the atmospheric pressure dropped so rapidly that Riker's ears popped with a painful, sharp crack. The wind stopped dead. The falling snow suspended in mid-air for a fraction of a second, caught in a sudden, terrifying vacuum of displaced magic. Riker gripped the frozen iron railing of the watchtower, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. He felt it before he saw it. A heavy, suffocating wave of alpha pheromones rolled over the tree line, completely overwhelming his senses. It was not the familiar, decaying scent of King Gideon's madness, nor was it the sterile, manipulative aura of Sibylla Frost. This was dual-layered. It smelled of violent, crackling ozone and deep, freezing shadows. The shockwave slammed into the border fence. Directly below the watchtower, the central shattered boundary stone, a massive slab of solid granite standing 20 feet tall, began to hum. The ancient runes carved into its surface flared with a sickly, warning red light. The object was designed to protect the royal domain for generations. But the energy radiating from the deep woods was not foreign. It was the absolute, concentrated essence of the Vance bloodline, violently mutated by the ancient Thorn lineage, demanding entry. The ancient monolith could not process the paradox. It vibrated with a high-pitched metallic shriek that forced the warden to drop to his knees, clapping his gloved hands over his bleeding ears. With a concussive, deafening boom, the granite exploded. Massive chunks of stone and iron shrapnel rained down across the snow-covered perimeter, carving deep craters into the frozen earth. The magical ward that had protected the ancient fortress for generations collapsed instantly, dissolving into a fine, sparkling mist of dead energy. Riker remained on his knees on the wooden platform of the watchtower, struggling to draw oxygen into his lungs. The sheer, crushing weight of the dual Alpha Aurus pressing down on his chest was paralyzing. He was a veteran soldier, a man who had stood beside his sovereign in the bloodiest rogue wars, but this power was entirely unprecedented. It was the raw, unhinged fury of an ancient lineage finally waking from its slumber. He slowly lowered his hands, staring out at the gaping, smoking crater where the boundary marker used to stand. Beyond it, the ancient thicket lay silent, dark, and utterly lethal. "Goddess preserve us," Riker whispered, his voice trembling in the freezing air. "They are coming." Back in the heart of the freezing forest, the violent dust inside the secluded cabin was finally beginning to settle. The apocalyptic pressure that had choked the room slowly receded, replaced by a heavy, resonant calm. Aveline pushed herself away from the timber wall. She brushed a layer of pulverized wood and ash from her boiled leather armor, her movements meticulously slow and deliberate. She did not rush. She did not panic. She simply lifted her chin and looked at the two towering figures standing amidst the wreckage of their sanctuary. The ascension was complete. Her son stood breathing heavily in the dim, flickering light of the recovering hearth. The physical transformation was absolute. The binding iron stones were gone, reduced to fine grey powder scattered across the floorboards. Their dual alpha marks, the black vortex and the silver lightning bolt, glowed with a steady, pulsing permanence on their broad shoulders. They were no longer boys hiding in the shadows. They were fully realized, apex sovereigns. Zephyr turned his head, his neck cracking sharply in the quiet room. His turbulent stare, a haunting, flawless mirror of Gideon Vance, were completely clear. The chaotic, volatile energy that had plagued his childhood was now entirely subjugated beneath his iron will. A faint hum of static electricity clung to his skin, but it no longer sparked erratically. It flowed with calculated, deadly precision. Cailan remained perfectly still. His silver eyes met Aveline's. He possessed his mother's absolute, terrifying calm. The darkness in the room did not just respond to him anymore. It worshipped him, wrapping around his ankles like loyal hounds, waiting for a command to kill. He was beautiful, the way a blade was beautiful, forged in the dark, lethal to the touch, and completely unwavering. "It is done," Cailan said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that resonated in Aveline's chest, carrying the dense, heavy authority of a true alpha. Aveline did not weep with maternal pride. She did not run forward to coddle them. She stood with her spine straight, acknowledging them not just as her sons, but as the supreme weapons she had spent 6 agonizing years forging in the ice. "The suppression is broken," Aveline said, her voice perfectly even, betraying zero emotion. "The shock wave will have reached the perimeter by now. The border wardens will report the anomaly to the central citadel. Sibylla Frost will send her hunters, and the Alpha King will finally have a scent to follow." "Let them come," Zephyr gritted out, his hands flexing, the knuckles cracking loudly. "I will break their bones before they cross the first ridge." "No," Aveline countered sharply. She walked slowly toward the back of the cabin, her heavy boots crunching over the splintered remains of the oak table. "We are done waiting in the dark. We are done playing prey." She knelt beside her narrow cot and pulled a heavy iron-bound chest from the shadows. The rusted lock gave way with a harsh snap. Inside, resting on a bed of folded, moth-eaten silk, tucked safely beneath the heavy woolen folds of the warden's old mantle, lay the final remnants of her past. She bypassed the few trinkets and practical tools, reaching directly for the false bottom of the heavy container. She pressed a hidden latch, revealing a shallow compartment. Resting inside was an ancient thorn heirloom. It was not the Winterbane crest she had left behind on the executioner's dais. This was older, forged from cold starlight and ancient iron, depicting a snarling beast wreathed in shadows. It had been passed down through generations of her ancestors, hidden from the Vance kings who feared its latent power. The heirloom was heavy, uncompromising, and entirely untainted by betrayal. Aveline lifted the heavy silver chain. The metal was freezing, biting into her scarred, calloused fingertips. She brought it up to her throat and secured the thick clasp behind her neck. The snarling silver wolf rested exactly over the jagged, invisible scar where her fated mate bond had been violently severed. The cold metal leached the phantom warmth from her skin, a physical reminder of her enduring isolation and the absolute failure of the soul fracture potion to erase her true worth. Not used, not owned, chosen. Aveline whispered the ancient thorn vow. The words felt completely different now. They were no longer a desperate plea for suppression. They were a declaration of absolute sovereignty. She reached back into the chest and withdrew a second item, Nestor's iron blade. It was a heavy iron blade forged by the old covens, gifted to Aveline before the rogue healer's death. Bound in thick strips of black leather and capped with cold steel, the weapon smelled of frozen earth, ozone, and ancient blood. It was an instrument designed not for ceremony, but for executing absolute, unyielding retribution. She stood up, gripping Nestor's iron blade tightly in her right hand. 6 years ago, I stood on the dais of the Grand Hall and accepted a rejection that was meant to break me, Aveline said, turning to face her towering sons. Her silver eyes were hard, calculating, and utterly devoid of mercy. They expected me to weep. They expected me to freeze in the dark. They believed we were small things in a world of teeth. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She reached out, her scarred hands resting flat against the heavily muscled chests of her dual alphas. The tactile sensation of their immense, thrumming power beneath her palms was the ultimate validation of her survival. But a name unspoken for 6 years grows teeth, Aveline continued, her voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register. And today, the isolated stronghold will learn exactly what I have been feeding in the dark. We are not going back to beg for our place. We are going back to take it. Cailan's jaw clenched, a feral possessive growl vibrating deep in his throat. The shadows in the cabin surged forward, expanding outward to coat the wooden walls in absolute pitch black. Zephyr's eyes flared with blinding silver light, a sharp gust of wind sweeping through the room, violently blowing the heavy wooden doors of the sanctuary completely off their iron hinges. The storm outside was waiting for them. Aveline stepped through the shattered doorway, crossing the threshold into the ferocious blizzard. The cold was immediate and absolute, but she did not pull her cloak tight around her shoulders. She did not shiver. The dormant, ancient magic in her bloodline flared in perfect synchronization with the dual alphas flanking her. Kalen stepped to her left. As his heavy boots hit the snow, the ambient shadows of the skeletal pines stretched outward, completely swallowing the biting wind, creating a perfectly still, soundless vacuum around his mother. Zephyr stepped to her right. The ambient temperature around him spiked violently. The falling snow vaporized into thick white steam before it could even touch the ground, leaving a dry, scorched path of exposed earth in his wake. They were an apocalyptic trinity, the banished Luna, the Shadow Alpha, and the Storm Alpha. Aveline lifted her chin, her silver eyes locking onto the distant, jagged peaks, where the northern keep lay decaying in its own arrogance. The march had begun. Every step they took down the treacherous, winding mountain path was deliberate and heavy. The whispering woods, the freezing predator that had tried to claim her life 6 years ago, now actively bowed to their presence. The massive pine branches physically bent backward, parting to clear a wide, unobstructed path for the true sovereigns of the north. She gripped Nesta's iron blade, the cold iron hilt biting into her palm. She did not draw it fully from its heavy leather sheath yet. She would save the killing steel for the gates of Valdren, to shatter the remaining illusions of Sibylla Frost and the fabricated lies of the forged ledger. She would bring the blade to announce to a broken, weeping king that his ghosts had returned to collect their due. The descent was entirely silent, save for the heavy, rhythmic crunch of their boots against the ice. A steady, metallic cadence that sounded exactly like a ticking clock, counting down the final hours of the usurper's reign. They walked out of the dark, and they brought the storm with them. The howling wind of the whispering woods faded into the slow, echoing drip of icy water. The cavernous main hall of the high castle had become an arena of predatory calculation. The air itself felt thick, choked by the scent of poisoned honey and ancient fear. Dust and pulverized mortar settled over the black iron dais where Sibylla Frost stood, her midnight velvet gown sweeping across the freezing flagstones like a shadow intent on consuming the throne. She held the forged ledger in her left hand, a thick parchment bound in crimson leather containing fabricated evidence of Aveline's treason, the very lies that had severed a dynasty, while her right hand tightly gripped a crystalline vial of biological poison. Its dark, viscous liquid glinted ominously under the pale moonlight, bleeding through the cracked stained glass. It was the soul fracture potion, the very poison that mimicked the physical feeling of a dying bond, forcing the user's beast into a state of violent paranoia. Before her, kneeling amidst the grey dust, was the shattered monarch. Gideon Vance had not cleaned the blood from his chest. The deep, jagged furrows he had clawed into his own flesh were still seeping raw crimson, staining his dark tunic, a visceral testament to the biological agony of the severed mate bond. Every labored breath he took rattled in his lungs, his physical deterioration accelerating with every second his true mate remained in the freezing dark. His weather-colored gaze was unfocused, hollow and defeated, staring blankly at the cold stone floor where Aveline Thorne had once left her winterbane crest. The usurper Duchess declared the reign of the Vance kings at an end, her voice ringing off the vaulted stone ceilings with practiced, melodic authority. 6 years of decline, and now he clawed at his own heart in the dark, speaking to ghosts. The court of Valdron was built to humble the weak, and the nobles clustered in the shadows like starving vultures, their eyes wide with a sick, opportunistic hunger. They wore garments of silver and grey, their faces beautiful in the way a winter frost is beautiful, completely devoid of warmth. Sibylla's elite guards, armed with heavy broadswords and cold iron shields, stepped forward, their metal boots echoing like a death knell. They formed a tight, lethal ring around the kneeling sovereign. They moved to enforce her claim, preparing to strip the iron crown from the head of a king who seemed too hollowed out by grief to resist. Gideon did not reach for his blade. He did not call his wolf. The terrifying physical presence that had once brought rival empires to their knees was entirely extinguished. He welcomed the cold steel. The phantom void in his chest was a raging inferno of regret, a biological execution that made death seem like a merciful escape. His beast whimpered internally, clawing at the empty space where a sacred thread woven between their souls had once resided. The sacred thread stretching, tearing, bleeding, until there was nothing left but absolute silence. If this was the price for sending his fated mate into the freezing dark, he would pay it on the Stosen days. The usurper raised the vial of the dark elixir, a cold smile freezing on her pale features as she signaled her guards to bind the fallen ruler. Before a single guard could advance, a sound shattered the quiet hall. It was not a knock or a warning. The massive double doors of dark iron and oak did not merely swing open. They were violently torn from their stone hinges in a blinding explosion of ozone and dark energy. The heavy iron doors slammed onto the flagstones with an apocalyptic boom that echoed through the mountain peaks, sending a concussive shockwave across the room. The sheer kinetic force of the impact rattled the foundations of the ancient fortress. A freezing, soundless vacuum rolled through the cavernous hall. The sudden temperature drop was visceral, an absolute winter chill that bit into the marrow. The torches along the stone pillars were instantly extinguished, snuffing out the warm amber light and leaving only the pale, ghostly moonlight to illuminate the threshold. Standing in the gaping doorway were three figures. Aveline Thorn stepped over the splintered wood, her posture immaculate, her spine a rod of forged steel. She did not look like a woman who had spent 6 years scavenging in the snow. She wore her boiled leather armor, her silver eyes glowing with an ancient, terrifying authority that made the cowering nobles drop to their knees in pure instinct. Secured around her neck was the ancient Thorn heirloom, a heavy silver chain depicting a snarling beast wreathed in shadows, worn directly over her severed mate bond scar. The metal rested against the very skin Gideon had once claimed. In her right hand, she held Nestor's iron blade, the heavy iron weapon forged by the old Covens, gifted to Aveline before the exile midwife's death. The dark leather grip rested comfortably in her calloused palm, the iron cold and ready for retribution. Flanking the former Luna were two towering apex predators, their physical presence suffocating the room with pure, unadulterated dominance. To her left stood Calen Thorn. The Shadow Alpha moved without making a single sound, his silver eyes locking onto the usurper Duchess with a lethal, calculating silence. Viscous, ink-like shadows poured from his skin, crawling across the flagstones like liquid iron, rapidly swallowing the ambient light in the room. The darkness bent to his will, a living, breathing extension of his suppressed rage. To her right stood Zephyr Thorn. The Storm Alpha's broad back crackled with brilliant blue static electricity, the air around him humming with a terrifying voltage that made the hair on every guard's arm stand on end. The scent of ozone and impending lightning flooded the hall, erasing the sickening aroma of Sibylla's poisoned honey. The usurper froze, her face draining of all color as her grip slipped slightly on the forged ledger. Her perfectly calculated coup unraveled in a heartbeat. She stared at the woman she had sent into the blizzard 6 years ago, the woman she assumed had perished in the ice. "A name unspoken for 6 years grows teeth, my king," Aveline said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a dense ancestral resonance that shattered the quiet. It was the voice of the wild timberland, untamed and absolute. Gideon lifted his head, his bloodshot storm cloud irises locked onto the woman he had banished into the blizzard. The world stopped spinning. The phantom agony in his chest did not vanish, but the biological recognition of her presence made his heart slam against his ribs with violent force. The freezing ache that had consumed his veins for 6 long winters suddenly sparked with a desperate, agonizing heat. His wolf, dormant and dying for years, suddenly thrashed against his ribs, howling for the mate it had never truly forsaken. Then his gaze shifted to the 2 towering men standing beside her. Physiological recognition hit the Alpha King like a physical blow. It was an instinctual, undeniable truth. Gideon stared at Zephyr's tempestuous slate eyes, an exact, terrifying mirror of his own. He looked at Kaelin's silver eyes and the broad, corded shoulders that carried the distinct, unmistakable markers of the Vance bloodline. Though barely 6 years had passed since their birth, the ancient territorial magic of their first shift had violently accelerated their growth. It had forged their childish frames into fully grown, adult warriors in a matter of days, adapting them to protect their mother. They bore the dual alpha marks, glowing brightly on their shoulders, completely stripped of their binding iron stones. The jagged pieces of cold iron carved with ancient thorn sigils that had once kept their power hidden were now gone. Twin sons, dual alphas, born in the frost while he had sat on a throne of lies. "My blood," Gideon gasped. A strangled, weeping sound caught in his throat as he realized the true scale of what he had thrown away. The realization was a physical weight, crushing his lungs, forcing him to witness the magnificent, lethal airs he had never known. The Duchess's composure completely shattered into panic. She pointed the vial of the toxic serum at the threshold and screamed for her elite guards to strike them down, her voice shrill and desperate. The guards charged, their heavy iron boots scraping against the stone floor, their broadswords raised in a desperate bid to maintain control. They never reached the threshold. Zephyr moved first. The Storm Alpha did not draw a sword. He simply planted his boots and brought his massive hands together in a single concussive clap. A sonic boom of pure elemental force detonated in the center of the hall. The shockwave physically lifted 6 armed guards off their feet, hurling them backward into the stone pillars with bone-crushing force. Their broadswords shattered into useless metal shrapnel before hitting the floor. The sheer kinetic energy left the remaining soldiers deafened and disoriented. Simultaneously, Kaelin unleashed the dark. The liquid shadows crawling across the flagstones surged forward like striking serpents, wrapping tightly around the ankles and wrists of the remaining traitors. The darkness was freezing, leaching the physical warmth and strength from their bodies in seconds. The guards shrieked in terror as the shadows dragged them down, pinning them flat against the cold stone, completely paralyzed. They were trapped in a void of absolute sensory deprivation, swallowed by the Shadow Alpha's wrath. Sibylla backed away toward the Iron Throne, her hands trembling violently. She raised the forged ledger to defend herself, a pathetic attempt to shield her body with fabricated lies. But Kaelin appeared before her in a silent blur of motion, bypassing the physical space in an instant. He did not strike her. He simply reached out and gripped the thick parchment bound in crimson leather. With an effortless twist of his calloused wrist, Kaelin tore the forged ledger in 2, dropping the torn crimson leather and fabricated evidence onto the floorboards. The physical proof of her treason was destroyed as easily as a dry leaf. The vial of the mind-altering concoction slipped from Sibylla's numb fingers, shattering uselessly against the cold stone. The soul fracture potion spilled its dark, viscous liquid across the dais, where it pooled like toxic blood. Kaelin's shadow tendrils reached up, wrapping around the usurper's throat, lifting her 2 inches off the ground. She gasped for air, her pale blue eyes wide with absolute, primal terror as she looked into the silver eyes of the boy she had tried to erase from existence. "Touch her again," Kaelin whispered, his deep voice carrying the freezing weight of the frozen wilderness, "and I will feed your soul to the dark." The cavernous hall fell into an absolute, breathless silence. The nobles of Valdron were pressed against the cold stone walls, their faces pale, their knees shaking as they witnessed the total, effortless destruction of the usurper's forces. The absolute mandate of the Alpha King had been physically usurped in a matter of seconds by 2 boys born in exile. Aveline stepped forward, her heavy leather boots making a steady, metallic cadence against the flagstones. She walked past the paralyzed guards, past the shredded remains of the forged ledger, stopping directly before the Iron Throne. Cailan dropped Sibylla Frost to the floor. The Duchess collapsed in a heap of midnight velvet, coughing violently, her arrogance entirely replaced by the pathetic, shivering desperation of a trapped rat. She clawed at her own throat, gasping for the freezing air. "The dungeons were where you went to be forgotten," Aveline said, looking down at the cowering Duchess with cold, unblinking silver eyes. She did not raise her voice, she did not need to. "And that is where you will spend the remainder of your days, Sibylla, in the cold iron dark." Riker Blackwood, who had entered the hall behind the Trinity, stepped forward alongside 4 loyal border guards. The border warden's face was a mask of stoic retribution. Without waiting for a command, he hauled the usurper Duchess to her feet, binding her wrists in heavy iron chains. Sibylla did not speak. She had no more lies to spin. She was dragged away into the lower depths of the keep, her fading footsteps marking the absolute end of her poisonous reign. The grand hall was clear, but the emotional climax of 6 years of agony was only beginning. Gideon Vance pulled himself forward on his hands and knees. The Alpha King, a man who had once ruled the North with absolute, uncompromising dominance, now crawled across the dusty stone floor toward his banished mate. He ignored the raw blood dripping from his chest, ignored his shattered pride, and ignored the staring nobles. Every movement was a grueling testament to his biological submission. He was a terrifying, dangerous ruler who was now entirely willing to kneel in the dust for a single glance of forgiveness. He stopped at Aveline's feet. Gideon looked up at her, his storm cloud irises overflowing with raw, unfiltered tears. His massive hands reached out, trembling violently, but he stopped his fingertips an inch from the hem of her boiled leather tunic. Refusing to touch her without permission, he could feel the latent heat radiating from her presence, a warmth that his frozen wolf had starved for, yet he maintained a brutal self-restraint. He would not force a bond she had learned to survive without. Aveline. Gideon wept, the sound tearing from the absolute depths of his hollowed-out soul. "I was blind. The poison, the potion. I tore the bond and sent you into the cold. I do not ask for your mercy. I ask only that you strike me down with your iron blade, for I cannot live another day carrying the weight of what I did to you." Slowly, meticulously, Gideon reached up and removed the iron crown from his head. The heavy metal circlet, etched with the royal wolves of Valdron, felt like lead in his hands. He held it up to her, offering his title, his kingdom, and his very life to the woman he had wronged. It was an act of complete, unconditional surrender. The assembled court held its breath. They waited for the collapse. They expected the former Luna to fall into his arms, to weep, to accept the groveling monarch and restore the severed bond. They expected a sudden, magical reconciliation that would erase 6 years of isolation. Aveline did not cry. She did not reach out to soothe his trembling shoulders. She did not offer the physical sensory relief of safe touch that he so desperately craved. She stood like a statue carved from winter itself, her posture straight, her chin lifted high. She looked down at the penitent king with a quiet, terrifying dignity that eclipsed every crown in the realm. She had maintained a straight spine through a public rejection, and she would maintain it through his public groveling. "The rejection ceremony was supposed to break me," Aveline said, her voice cutting through the silent hall like a honed blade. "You expected me to weep on the dais. You expected me to freeze in the exiled pines. I survived the cold because I carried something far greater than your regret." She reached down and took the iron crown from his hands, but she did not place it upon her own head, nor did she hand it back to the penitent king. Aveline turned to face her sons. "I reject your bond, Gideon," Aveline said, her silver eyes glowing with absolute authority. and I will not mend what was destroyed in the dark. Not used, not owned, chosen. She stepped toward Cailan and Zephyr. From beneath her leather tunic, she adjusted the ancient thorn heirloom, the heavy silver chain depicting a snarling beast, wreathed in shadows. She unclasped it and placed the Radiance, ancient artifact, around Zephyr's neck. The heavy silver settled against his chest, its ancestral magic instantly merging with his crackling storm magic in a brilliant flash of blue light. Then, lifting the iron crown, Aveline placed it firmly onto Cailan's head. "The reign of the Vance Kings is over," Aveline declared, her voice echoing into every corner of the vast keep, rewriting the history of the realm with a single sentence. "I give this kingdom to the ones who were forged in the frost. I crown Cailan and Zephyr Thorn as the joint supreme alphas of Valdron." The moment the crown rested on Cailan's head, the ancient, territorial magic of the northern peaks reacted to the true bloodline. A massive, golden shockwave exploded from the stone dais. It was not a destructive force, but a profound, miraculous environmental thaw. The spidery patterns of ice on the walls instantly melted away into clear, sparkling water. The cracked stained glass windows glowed with a sudden, brilliant amber light as the perpetual blizzard outside subsided, revealing the warm golden rays of the rising sun. The bitter winter that had choked the kingdom was finally banished by the physical presence of the true heirs. The hearths in the grand hall burst into roaring, golden fires, filling the freezing chamber with a rich, comforting sense of pine, cedar, and dry hearth warmth. The land, frozen for 6 brutal years under the curse of a severed bond, accepted its true sovereigns. The contrast between the freezing terror of the usurper reign and the blinding, golden heat of the Thorn bloodline was absolute. The court of Valdron, built to humble the weak, now knelt in weeping, breathless reverence before the strength of the outcasts. Gideon Vance did not rise. He remained on his hands and knees in the warm golden light, his head bowed until his forehead touched the flagstones. The raw, jagged furrows in his chest slowly stopped bleeding as the ancient magic of the keep recognized the shift in power. The crushing void in his chest had not vanished entirely, but the biological agony of the severing was finally soothed by the overwhelming instinctual presence of his fated bloodline. He did not ask for his crown back. He did not reach out to touch his mate's boots. He simply exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that carried 6 years of poisoned frost out of his lungs. He was no longer the Alpha King. He was a broken man meeting his magnificent sons in the ruins of his own arrogance. "My kings," Gideon whispered, his voice cracking with a profound, breaking relief. He accepted his penance in the dust. A month passed, and the ice never returned. The cavernous main hall of the sprawling stronghold was no longer an arena of predatory calculation. It had become a sanctuary of living, breathing stone. The heavy scent of poisoned honey was gone entirely, scrubbed from the flagstones and burned away in the hearths, replaced by the rich, elemental aroma of pine needles, hot wood smoke, and melting snow. The fabled woods were thawing. For the first time in a generation, the ancient, skeletal trees were drinking in the golden sunlight that now bathed the valley, coaxing small, resilient moonflowers to bloom through the retreating frost. Aveline stood on the high stone balcony of the royal chambers, her hands resting lightly on the sun-warmed balustrade. She wore Riker Blackwood's patrol cloak draped securely over her shoulders, the heavy wool a constant, physical reminder of the freezing night she had chosen survival over despair. Her silver eyes were calm, reflecting the endless blue of the clear sky. She remembered her sons as toddlers, learning to wield shadows and sparks in the snow, before the territorial magic had accelerated their physical ascension. Now, the phantom ache of the severed bond had quieted into a dull, distant memory, replaced by the fierce, roaring warmth of her children's proximity. She was the Lunar Mother now, unbowed and absolute. Nesta's iron blade rested on the stone beside her calloused hand, a silent vow that would forever mark their history. The winter had finally broken, replaced by a dawn that belonged entirely to them. Thank you for listening to this story. If you felt the warmth of this sanctuary, please take 2 seconds to like, leave a comment with your favorite scene, and subscribe to our channel for more serialized tales of quiet triumphs.